This channel is part of the History Hit network. Stick around to find out more.
In late 1943, the Allied nations were gaining ground on all major fronts in the global war against the aggressors in Europe and Asia. In October, American and British fighting men were moving up the Italian peninsula toward Rome. In Eastern Europe, the Red Army was pushing back the Nazis in the Ukraine and the Crimea. In the South Pacific, American Marines were preparing to assault a major Japanese stronghold in the northern Solomons, the island of Bougainville. In Washington in mid-1943, the chiefs of Allied fighting forces agreed that the offensive against the enemy in the South Pacific must... It was of the utmost importance to Allied leaders that a strict plan be formulated, which would call for the knocking out of the enemy's key South Pacific. With Guadalcanal and Georgia Group in U.S. hands, the campaign up the Solomons ladder reached its final phase, the assault against Bougainville. At newly won bases, preparations were made for the operation against that Japanese island stronghold. First step in the campaign was the mounting of an air offensive of sufficient proportions to soften up the island for the invasion, and also to knock out other enemy airfields within fighter range. In the late summer 1943, U.S. forces prepared to launch the attack against Japanese positions in the strategic northern Solomons, in the campaign which would give the U.S. control of the entire Solomons chain. Every now and then, the men at the forward bases took a few minutes off from military duties. Tireless performers like Joe E. Brown knew well how important it was for the men to relax. Even the big brass forgot about the war once in a while. To the westward in Australia, Southwest Pacific Theater Commander General Douglas MacArthur endorsed the proposed attack on Bougainville. Though not under his direct command, the operation was to be conducted under his supervision. The offensive was carefully timed. While GIs drove up the coast of New Guinea, Marines pushed the attack up the Solomon chain to Bougainville. Weeks before the invasion date, planes equipped with cameras crisscrossed the target film. The planes raced back to their base with their high-priority cargo. At the base, other members of the unit were waiting, ready to go to work on the film. The job done by the photo reconnaissance units in the Pacific during World War II was a key factor in the success of U.S. invasions in that theater. On the reconnaissance camera and its efficient use depended the lives of thousands of American fighting men. The successive steps in the operation were carefully coordinated so that no time would be lost.
If you love history, then you'll love History Hit. We have tons of exclusive documentaries about the most important people in history that you will not find anywhere else. Whether it's exploring the ruins and secrets of the Second World War, or rediscovering lost stories from the front of the First World War, there is a war story waiting for you on History Hit. With an unrivaled catalogue of military history documentaries, it is a must-have for any lover of history. We're committed to bringing history fans award-winning documentaries and podcasts that you cannot find anywhere else. Sign up now for a 14-day free trial, and War Stories fans get 50% off their first 3 months. Just be sure to use the code WARSTORIES at checkout.
Less than an hour after the enemy territory had been photographed, the evidence was being developed at a forward U.S. base. The most recently prepared enemy installations were now relatively easy for U.S. intelligence officers to locate. Every square mile of the area under consideration was examined and re-examined by skilled photo interpreters, who spotted camouflaged gun positions which would prove of particular interest to Navy gun crews and bomber pilots. With their targets pinpointed, the pilots wasted no time in adding the finishing touches to the operation. Often it was only a few hours from the time the area had been photographed to the moment when bombs were falling on the newly spotted positions. For several weeks, U.S. bombers gave Bougainville and the adjacent islands a thorough going-over, preparatory to the invasion. In early October 1943, troops of the 3rd Marine Division, which was to make the assault, began boarding ship at forward U.S. bases. The vessels which were to carry the invasion units to the landing beaches were combat-loaded. That is, equipment was packed into the ships in such a way that the vehicles and supplies which would be needed first could be unloaded immediately. Finally, all the preparations were completed, and the campaign against Bougainville was ready to be launched. The ships carrying the assault waves moved out of their berths at the rendezvous area on the morning of October 31st. The most important offensive against the enemy in the Solomons since the attack on Guadalcanal was underway. Every ship in the area that could be spared was pressed into service for the operation. Preceding the main assault at Bougainville, a preliminary landing was made on the Treasury Islands by New Zealand troops in late October. In addition, U.S. Marines made a landing on Choiseul to draw the enemy's attention to that island. Meanwhile, the main assault force moved toward Bougainville. On November 1st, the invasion fleet was in position offshore. American commanders anticipated very heavy enemy resistance. At 6:45 on D-Day morning, Marines of the 3rd Division took to the boats and prepared for their first engagement with the enemy. But a few of the officers and non-coms were veterans of other campaigns with other divisions. The operational plans called for the first wave of assault troops to land at the beaches of Empress Augusta Bay at 7:30 on the morning of November 1st. 4 minutes ahead of schedule, the first waves of Marines hit the beach under strong enemy fire. The tension which always preceded an invasion was broken. Once ashore, the Marines went about their business as they'd been taught. The battle for the beachhead was hotly contested. After the initial foothold had been won, the usual precautions had to be taken to ensure the successful defense of that tiny area. Any enemy counterattack would have to contend with a firmly entrenched beachhead force. But the invading troops were concerned not only with defense. The Marines subscribed to the theory that the best defense is a good offense, and followed that course in the campaign on Bougainville. Until the enemy force at Cape Torokina was overcome, the battle was one of small groups. Marine emphasis on small unit training, especially in rifle squad and platoon tactics, paid off on Bougainville. The enemy had to be dug out of the jungle. The pattern for reducing enemy positions was growing steadily more efficient. The flamethrower enabled U.S. combat teams to achieve their objectives more rapidly, and thereby saved many American lives. The seizure of Cape Torokina was the key to success. The winning of the American beachhead on Bougainville was no easy job. The Marines of the 3rd Division who made the assault and the soldiers of the 37th Army Division who joined the battle on the 8th day suffered considerable casualties. But the strategy called for much more than a mere foothold along the beach. The drive inland to establish a perimeter of larger proportions was stepped up, and the Marines and soldiers seized every advantage to extend the American-held territory farther into the interior. The close integration of ground forces with tanks, functioning together smoothly, proved its effectiveness in gaining ground against the enemy. Meanwhile, directly following the invasion at Empress Augusta Bay, a Japanese fleet raced southward from Rabaul toward Bougainville, bent on wiping out the beachhead force. The Japanese fleet included 3 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, and 6 destroyers. Originally, the enemy had planned to bring troop ships down for a counter-landing. But after the Japanese fleet had been spotted by Allied aircraft, the fast warships continued alone, intent on annihilating the American amphibious forces. The enemy's plan called for a quick strike to be accomplished before U.S. naval units could get set. Thus, the enemy was counting on surprise. But the U.S. Navy was not caught off guard. A force of 4 cruisers and 8 destroyers headed north from the Central Solomons, and thanks to accurate information on the movements of the enemy fleet, intercepted the Japanese naval units at a point some 45 miles northwest of Empress Augusta Bay. The battle was joined at 2:45 in the morning of November 2nd. The head-on battle raged for 5.5 hours. American gunners were finding their targets with considerable success. The enemy force suffered severe losses. The naval battle of Empress Augusta Bay was an overwhelming U.S. victory. Ashore, the Marines and soldiers were engaged in a series of continuing actions. Throughout November, the campaign to extend the American beachhead was a grueling job of driving the enemy off virtually every square foot of the territory in question. The assignment called for all perseverance the U.S. fighting men could muster. With materiel arriving on Bougainville in greater quantities, the offensive against the stubbornly resisting enemy developed more and more power as the weeks went by. American ground forces knew well with what determination the enemy would fight. Before each thrust, artillery was brought into play to soften up the area. The artillerymen often had their targets pinpointed for them by light spotter planes, which proved invalidating new enemy positions for the gunners. Admiral Bull Halsey arrived on Bougainville and checked over the progress of the fighting with Marine General Roy Geiger, who had taken over as ground forces commander the day before. The Admiral, as commander of the South Pacific, seemed well satisfied with the course of the action and the fight for control of the last enemy island in the Solomons. One group of Marines drove inland along the Piva Trail against mounting resistance. By mid-November, they had penetrated nearly 3 miles here, encountered an enemy ambush at Coconut Grove. The Marines attacked all along the line. All that day, the Marines carried the fight to the enemy and slowly took possession of the area. After the engagement at Coconut Grove, there was a general advance along the entire front. But trouble ahead, and the troops were expecting it. On November 15th, Marines gained more than 1,000 yards along the Numa Numa Trail, while at other points along the front, soldiers and Marines gained up to 1,500 yards in the day's advance. By November 19th, the Marines had progressed along the Numa Numa Trail beyond the juncture of 2 branches of the Piva River. Some 900 Japanese were killed during the first 3 weeks of the fight for Bougainville. But the men sensed that the big battle was just shaping up. That day, advanced Marine patrols ran into heavy enemy fire. The Battle of Piva Forks in the memory of the men who fought there. Men like Marine Captain John Scott of South Bend, Indiana.
Our battalion, the 3rd Battalion, the left flank. Our objective was the high ground which the enemy commanded. To our battalion, the taking of that ground was the toughest part of the Bougainville Campaign. The enemy had penetrated our position, and we had to shoot it out with him at point-blank range. Often the enemy was little more than 10 yards away. One of our companies was all but knocked out in the pitched battle. At Piva Forks, the 796 Marines of our battalion were opposed by some 4,000 enemy troops, giving them man for man about a 6-to-1 advantage. But we took the high ground and staved off a quick enemy counterattack. In the late afternoon of November 21st, after a day of very tough going, we had our objective, and we hung on to it. We wiped out quite a number of enemy troops, but there were still quite a lot left. Our Japanese language specialists worked hard to get them to surrender. Taking prisoners was worth all the trouble it usually turned out to be. Most Japanese soldiers, of course, preferred not to give themselves up. They couldn't seem to believe that they wouldn't be tortured and shot. From time to time, our intelligence officers picked up some really valuable information, sometimes from the prisoners themselves, sometimes from documents which they carried with them. Strangely, many of the captured Japanese were quite willing to talk. Some volunteered information about their units in great detail. Naturally, these indications of the current positions and plans for immediate movement of their units were of great value to our commanders. In our part of the Battle of Piva Forks, 1,696 Japanese were killed by our battalion alone. We suffered some casualties too, but not many in comparison. Of course, to the men who were hit, it was the toughest battle of all, no matter how light the casualty figures. In the 3rd Battalion, 3rd Marine Regiment, 107 men were wounded at Piva Forks, and 27 men in our battalion didn't make it.
With an extended beachhead secured via the victory in the six-day battle at Piva Forks and in other brief but bitter engagements with the enemy, work was rushed on the airstrips, which would give the U.S. control of the entire Solomons area. While the fighting continued a few miles inland, Seabees worked at top speed to finish the precious strips. Once again at Bougainville, the Marston mat proved its value as an effective foundation for a landing strip in a territory that was often likely to be muddy. Before long, the strip was in perfect operating condition, safe enough to enable the Air Force to bring in a precious cargo, the first batch of Army nurses, who, in a matter of moments, turned Bougainville from a hot, foul-smelling patch of ground into a pleasant, stimulating tropical island. By the end of 1943, the American perimeter, which had been the U.S. objective at Bougainville, was firmly established. From that small area, U.S. forces controlled the island and the entire northern Solomons group as well. But the U.S. had to pay dearly for the territory inside that perimeter. During the campaign on Bougainville, nearly 1,000 Marines and soldiers gave their lives. And another field of crosses on one more Pacific island marked their sacrifice. By December, the men who had been in the lines for weeks began to enjoy some of the little luxuries of life. After a diet of straight K rations, the men had to get accustomed slowly to regular meals. They'd almost forgotten food could taste so good. Less than a month after D-Day, the men on Bougainville had their own bakery, which turned out bread, rolls, and cake for thousands of hungry customers. In 1944, a sizable quantity of fruits and vegetables was raised right on the island to help provide a balanced diet for the men who were still putting in a good day's work guarding the perimeter. The camp truck farmers had the willing cooperation of the island's Melanesian natives who worked at odd jobs. The Japanese soldiers who had been taken prisoner during the fighting felt a little more relaxed than they had at the time they passed into American hands. Their fears about their treatment by U.S. troops had pretty well evaporated after the first few weeks. Occasionally, new prisoners would be brought in, captured in the minor skirmishes which still occurred in the interior. And some Japanese soldiers actually gave themselves up voluntarily.
How is the condition of supplies of the Japanese forces at the present time?
君たちの食用やその他食べ物ですね、はい、状況はどうですか？今のところはもう非常に困ってるですよな。
Very scarce, sir. Would that be one of the reasons why you decided to come over to our side? Give yourself up.
食べ物があまりないから捕虜になる気になったんですか？いや、そうじゃないんです。自分はそれはどうですか？実際はもう軍隊が入ったんですな。あんま長を使って使うたあげくにもうそういうざまじゃからですな。
He got tired of the Japanese army life.
With the battle for Bougainville won, U.S. troops could really relax and enjoy the programs from Radio Tokyo, broadcast for their benefit.
And hello to all my little American blockheads on Bougainville. Do my records remind you of home, of your wives and sweethearts? Lay down your arms and go home to them.
Go forward, men of courage in the freedom fight. Let justice reign, let freedom song fill every heart with joy.
The epic battle at Tarawa in November 1943 brought home to the American public the cost of the war against Japan. Though Tarawa had been won at a great price, the lessons learned there were to prevent the loss of other thousands of American fighting men in battles on other Pacific islands. In January 1944, an invasion of the Marshall Islands was undertaken, an invasion whose success depended in large measure on the experience gained at Tarawa. In the Central Pacific, the Marshall Islands constituted a block in the path of the U.S. drive westward. If that drive was to be successful, several strategically located islands in that group must be seized. In Hawaii, Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, and everyone in his command were vitally concerned with the preparations for the forthcoming assault on the Marshalls. For the Central Pacific Offensive, begun so auspiciously with the victories in the Gilbert Islands at Macon and Tarawa, depended for its success on a quick follow-up. The planned invasion of atolls in the next major island chain, the Marshalls, was to be followed by further assaults on islands still far to westward, in a giant island-hopping operation, which would take American fighting forces to the very doorstep of Japan itself. In January 1944, the High Command in the Central Pacific Theater checked carefully over final preparations for the all-important invasion of the Marshalls. The amphibious assault force left Hawaii behind and headed for the Marshalls in late January. Stealthily, the fleet moved into enemy waters. Gunners in the mightiest invasion fleet yet mounted prepared to knock out enemy defenses on the target islands. This time, they planned to see to it that no one could possibly consider the naval shelling too light. On January 29th, the warships began their softening up of Kwajalein Atoll. For weeks, liberators of the 7th Air Force pounded the atolls in the eastern and central Marshalls. At Kwajalein, the world's largest coral atoll, the main objectives were 3 small islands. Roy and Namur, linked by an artificial causeway, were to be seized by the 4th Marine Division. En route to the invasion of the islands, Marine officers familiarized the men with all available details of their objective, their size, shape, and defenses. At Kwajalein Atoll, the 4th Marine Division went into action for the first time. Most of the men had arrived only recently from Marine training camps in the United States. For the first time, the assault waves took their own supplies with them. H-hour, delayed almost 2 hours, was only minutes away. The men would be real veterans soon. Waves of Marines neared the landing beaches, the carrier pilots gave the enemy a last-minute once-over. The men were prepared for another Tarawa. American troops were storming the first piece of pre-war Japanese territory. And from all indications, the enemy planned to hold on to it. The 4th Division Marines were loaded for action. They were prepared for the worst. It was tough on the beach, but it was no Tarawa. Although enemy resistance was lighter than expected, the battle was no pushover. The area was still far from secure. The troops at Kwajalein benefited enormously from the experience other American fighting men had had on similar atolls in the Gilberts some 2 months before. The pattern for dealing with a dug-in enemy on a tiny sand spit of an island had been successfully established. The Marines took every precaution in dealing with the fanatical defenders of Roy and Namur. The Marines took some prisoners at Roy and Namur, but they represented only a small percentage of the enemy force which defended the island. 264 Japanese were captured on the two islands. But there were still many pockets of enemy resistance. On Roy, the principal objective was the enemy airfield. Taking it was no simple task. During the afternoon, the battle raged on. By late afternoon, the back of enemy resistance on Roy was broken. This time, the naval and air bombardment had achieved some notable results. The airfield on Roy was seized on D-Day afternoon. The strips had constituted an important launching platform for enemy planes. A number of the Japanese planes had been in no condition to leave the island before it fell. Namur was wrested from the enemy by the early afternoon of the second day. On that island, too, the sturdy Japanese blockhouses had proved unable to withstand the U.S. bombardment. The enemy defenses were a favorite subject for combat artists, who sometimes accompanied the assault troops on Pacific invasions. The blockhouses proved equally fascinating to every Marine on the island. The enemy high command had ordered Roy and Namur defended to the last man. Marine General Holland Smith, in command of the ground forces in the Marshalls, was well pleased with the performance of the untested 4th Marine Division. The general was favorably impressed, too, with the job the Navy warships had done. In other operations, he was not usually satisfied with the Navy's bombardment. But at Kwajalein, he felt they had done well by his amphibious forces. The Japanese who garrisoned Roy and Namur hadn't believed it possible for their stronghold to fall to an American overwater assault. After the battle, the Marines had an opportunity to inspect the souvenirs they'd collected. The most highly prized memento throughout the Pacific was a Japanese samurai sword, usually carried only by high-ranking enemy officers. There was plenty of Japanese money for the invaders, but no place to spend it. The men who'd made the assault hadn't had a chance to take their shoes off since leaving the transports for the invasion. They almost felt civilized again. With the battle won, U.S. forces had reached another milestone on the road to Tokyo. Many of the men who had helped achieve that forward step had been cut down during the battle. In all cases possible, positive identification of the dead was sought by the Graves Registration Section of the 4th Marine Division. Casualties were light compared with the figures of American losses on Tarawa. But 190 Marines lost their lives at Roy and Namur in the struggle to establish a foothold for U.S. forces in the Marshalls. Each new victory in the drive across the Pacific was marked by still another burial service and the dedication of another square of hallowed ground, thousands of miles from home. The men who survived felt a very real sense of loss, for a strong feeling of kinship springs up between men in battle for a common cause. The dead would not be forgotten by the men who had fought with them side by side. Meanwhile, the U.S. Army's 7th Division was occupied with the enemy on the southernmost island of Kwajalein Atoll. On February 1st, in mid-morning, the assault waves moved into the beach. These GIs had last seen action in the Aleutians in quite a different setting. World War II was the first major war to be thoroughly covered by combat cameramen. To record the war on film, motion picture cameramen went ashore with the first waves of assault troops and stayed with them in the thick of the fight. The 7th Division GIs pushed across the island against spotty enemy opposition. On that first day on Kwajalein, U.S. casualties were light. Less than 70 men were hit by enemy fire. With the tanks pacing the advance, the GIs took the island yard by yard. The soldiers pressed the attack in the face of stiffening enemy resistance. Tanks played a major role in the victories in the marshes, but it was still the men with the rifles who seized and held the territory. On Kwajalein Islet, the coordination of tanks and infantry operating together had still not been perfected. But the advance was well executed. It was no easy job to overwhelm all the enemy troops on the island. For 5 days, the 7th Division GIs battled the enemy on Kwajalein. And for 5 days, the enemy had to be located and blasted out of his hold. More enemy soldiers were being knocked out of the battle by the determined GIs. Enemy casualties mounted steadily. The weary GIs continued the attack against a well-entrenched enemy. As on Roy and Namur to the north, the Japanese garrison on Kwajalein Islet had solid positions from which to carry on their stubborn defense of the island. In the process of seizing the islet from the enemy, 1,214 American soldiers were hit on Kwajalein. The lightness of American casualties could be traced to the more careful preparation on the part of both the Army and Navy. On February 5th, the battle on Kwajalein Islet had been won. After the spirited struggle, 170 enemy troops were taken prisoner, all that was left of a garrison force of some 4,000. The enemy had lost the 3 key islands of one of the most strategic atolls in the Central Pacific. The defeated troops were beginning to have a few doubts about the invincibility of the Japanese war machine. In February 1944, U.S. forces pushed deeper into enemy territory, to the extreme western end of the Marshall Islands chain. Eniwetok Atoll was invaded in mid-February by 2 regiments, 1 Marine, 1 Army. The 22nd Marine Regiment landed first on Njebe Island, and in a furious day-long battle knocked out a strong enemy garrison. The Marines on Njebe were seeing action for the first time, and they acquitted themselves well. Tanks were used to good advantage in the Marine assault on Njebe. The 3 principal islets of Eniwetok Atoll were successfully seized by the 5 battalions of Marines and soldiers in 7 days. On Eniwetok Islet, U.S. soldiers and Marines choked off enemy resistance, but not without suffering some losses. Many of the casualties among the riflemen were attributable to the light bombardment of this particular islet. On Parry Islet, 22nd Regiment Marines fought almost a duplicate of their earlier battle on Njebe, except that the enemy on Parry held out a bit more stubbornly. But the Marines mopped it up on the 2nd day. During the final stages of the fight to seize the major islands of Eniwetok Atoll, work on the airstrips was being carried forward, often under enemy fire, by the hard-working members of a Navy service known as the Seabees. Organized early in World War II, the Navy's construction battalions achieved miracles in building airstrips on islands all across the Pacific in unbelievably short periods of time and under any conditions. The Seabees never wasted any time. The job was always done the quickest possible way. And the Seabees never lost an opportunity to take advantage of whatever came their way, including enemy equipment. On Eniwetok Atoll, a strip capable of accommodating 4 squadrons of fighters was hurriedly finished. The speed with which the Seabees could build an airstrip on any kind of terrain was a constant source of wonder to the fighting men in the area. Even the Army was impressed with the Seabees' accomplishments in the Pacific. The work of the construction battalions on islands all across the Pacific was greatly admired by the Marine Corps, charged with seizing and holding those bases. The Seabees' most vital functions included the construction and repair of airstrips, of coral and sand. For on the speed with which those airstrips were put into operation depended the speed of the continuing advance toward Japan. The majority of the 250,000 men in the Seabees had had experience in some phase of construction work before entering the service. That experience proved invaluable to the U.S. fighting forces. But even the most knowledgeable construction men were faced with many completely new problems on the islands of the Pacific. Once their job was done, the Seabees never had long to wait to see the results of their work. Windmill washing machines became familiar sights on the islands where the Seabees were on the job. Just one evidence of the versatility of the Navy's newest branch. But aids to comfortable living in the tropics were only spare time projects. After the airstrips were built or repaired on an island base, The Seabees fell to work on the construction of the necessary buildings for the forces which would garrison the new base. The job of creating a camp the size of a small city was usually only a few weeks' work for a battalion of Seabees. Their favorite boast, "We do the difficult immediately, the impossible takes a little longer," was not considered an overstatement by the troops in the Pacific. The housing of the fighting men was only one of the Seabees' responsibilities. One of the impossible jobs they performed was providing ice at tropical Pacific bases. Whatever the need, the Seabees could be counted on to fill it, and without delay. Their philosophy was summed up in a standard two-word answer to any request: can do. The U.S. now had possession of two key atolls in the Marshalls Group. Those two quick victories on a few sandy islands made a considerable difference in the areas of control exercised by the two principal warring powers in the Pacific. For from the Marshalls, the U.S. Air Force was in excellent position to launch attacks against the Caroline Islands, and in particular the enemy's powerful base at Truk. From Kwajalein in mid-March, 7th Air Force bombers began a series of strikes against that enemy stronghold. The Liberators could make the trip from Kwajalein to Truk and return in less than 9 hours, if the weather was favorable for that period. The 7th Air Force planes were reinforced by bombers of the 13th Air Force operating from South Pacific bases. The target, the group of islands called Truk, was the most important enemy staging area between Japan and the Southwest Pacific. The legend of Truk's invincibility was about to be punctured effectively. The Liberators were depositing the new 2,000-pound bombs on the enemy's base. The attacks were highly successful. In less than 4 months, once mighty Truk was to become virtually useless to the enemy. In a single month in early 1944, U.S. Air Force planes dropped a total of 1,813 tons of bombs on Truk. The enemy's stronghold was reduced to a mere shell. In the Southwest Pacific, as 1943 turned into 44, the U.S. fighting forces centered their attention on the Bismarck Archipelago and the northern coast of New Guinea, the road which led back to the Philippines.
Freedom and justice for